When a superpower becomes too used to getting its way, it begins to believe that influence equals control, and that dissent is either a threat or a mistake. This is precisely where America miscalculated in its attempt to isolate India. It wasn't just a strategic error, it was a psychological one. For decades, the United States operated from a position of hegemonic confidence. Its alliances, institutions, media, and military strength gave it the illusion that global consensus was merely a matter of time and pressure. But what it failed to grasp, what it has repeatedly failed to grasp, is that nations like India do not play by the old colonial scripts anymore. You see, power has a strange way of distorting perception. When you're at the top of the global hierarchy, there's a tendency to view disagreement as defiance and independence as disobedience. America's leadership saw India's refusal to align on certain issues, notably with regards to defense neutrality, energy imports, and its refusal to condemn certain nations on cue as betrayal. But from India's perspective, this wasn't rebellion. It was sovereignty, it was agency, and more importantly, it was a statement India does not bend just to be accepted by the West. The arrogance of hegemony is rooted in the belief that dominance is permanent. But the world doesn't work that way anymore. What America underestimated was India's long-standing ability to hold its ground. Not through loud aggression, but through quiet, firm positioning. India has mastered the art of being too important to ignore, too principled to control, and too grounded in history to be bullied by temporary narratives. This misjudgment wasn't about military might or economic sanctions. It was psychological. America assumed India's need for global validation was greater than its commitment to strategic autonomy. It assumed that pressure, whether diplomatic, economic, or media-driven, would produce compliance. But India didn't flinch, not because it was being stubborn, but because it was being clear. Clear in its identity, its priorities, and its role in a world that no longer rotates around Western whims. The humiliation, then, wasn't in any single diplomatic moment. It was in the realization that India had outgrown the leash without ever snapping it, that a nation once seen as a developing afterthought had now matured into a sovereign equal, and perhaps, in some ways, a moral superior. Because in a world where power is often exercised without accountability, India's restraint became its quiet strength. What America failed to understand is that influence without insight leads to missteps. You cannot isolate a country that is already anchored in its own values. You cannot intimidate a nation that has nothing to prove, and you certainly cannot humble a civilization that has already endured centuries of conquest and risen from it with dignity intact. Sometimes, the greatest humiliation comes not from being defied, but from realizing you never had the control you assumed in the first place. In global politics, silence is often misread as weakness, and neutrality, especially when maintained over decades, is frequently misunderstood as indecision or passivity. But India's stance on non-alignment has never been about avoiding conflict. It's been about avoiding submission. It's a philosophy deeply rooted in its civilizational DNA. The ability to engage without being consumed, to cooperate without being colonized, and to navigate complexity without losing moral center. America and much of the Western Bloc failed to grasp this subtlety. They mistook India's refusal to take sides as a lack of commitment, when in fact it was a deeper form of commitment to sovereignty, to self-respect, and to a multipolar world where no single empire dictates terms. This strategic non-alignment is not a relic of the Cold War, it's a living strategy adapted for a chaotic new world order. In an age where countries are expected to fall in line with ideological camps, East or West, autocracy or democracy, India continues to choose a third path, one of strategic independence. And that path is not one of isolation, but of self-direction. It allows India to trade with Russia when necessary, partner with the US on defense where beneficial, and still build strong ties with the global South, all without pledging undying loyalty to any single master. That is not confusion, that is clarity. This was perhaps the most frustrating part for American policymakers, because they weren't facing a hostile nation, they were facing a confident one, and confidence rooted in cultural memory and national self-awareness is hard to shake. India doesn't just remember colonization, it remembers surviving it. It remembers being forced to serve empires, and it remembers breaking free. That kind of memory doesn't make a country aggressive, it makes it cautious. It makes it aware of how easily influence can become control, and how quickly partnership can slip into dominance. So when the United States attempted to pressure India into towing the line on global conflicts or sanctions, expecting it to pick a side, India simply didn't. Not because it was indifferent, but because it refuses to be anyone's pawn. It's a conscious strategy, not an accident. And the deeper truth is that this form of silent resistance, of not reacting, not explaining, not bending, was far more powerful than open rebellion. because it sent a message to the world: India does not need to be validated by power blocks. It validates itself by its choices, by its priorities, and by its refusal to betray its long-term interests for short-term approval. In a world that rewards noise, India chose clarity. In a system built on dependency, India chose direction. And in a time where allegiance is often bought or coerced, India chose its own terms. That is not just policy, it is philosophy in motion, and perhaps the lesson is this: sometimes the most courageous act is not to fight for a side, but to stand for yourself. There's a certain arrogance in believing that economic pressure can be used as a weapon without consequence, especially when that pressure is aimed at a nation whose economic rise you've quietly come to depend on. That's the contradiction the United States stumbled into when it tried, overtly and covertly, to isolate India on the global stage. What policymakers in Washington failed to calculate was that India was no longer the struggling post-colonial economy it once was. It had transformed, quietly, steadily, into a critical node in the world's supply chains, a hub of intellectual capital, and a force in sectors that even the U.S. relies on: pharmaceuticals, IT, space tech, defense production, and energy diversification. The idea that India could be cornered economically was rooted in outdated assumptions. But assumptions, when left unchallenged, become blind spots. America believed that by cutting off certain trade privileges, by leveraging diplomatic channels, or by threatening consequences over foreign policy choices, it could make India fall in line. But the world economy isn't unipolar anymore, and India isn't desperate for access. It's become a gateway, not just to Asia, but to emerging markets, new technological ecosystems, and even ideological alternatives to Western models of growth. This wasn't a sudden development. It was the result of decades of self-reliance policies, combined with liberal reforms that opened just enough to attract investment while retaining national control. India plays a long game, building internal capacity while creating external partnerships, and in that process, it has become too integrated to be isolated. Cutting ties with India today doesn't punish India, it punishes those who try to cut them. That's the part that stings. When America tried to assert economic pressure, it quickly discovered how many of its own corporations, investors, and industries were deeply embedded in Indian markets. From Silicon Valley tech firms to defense contractors, from big pharma to renewable energy investors, India wasn't on the margins, it was in the middle. This economic entanglement is not just transactional, it's strategic. India has positioned itself as indispensable to those who once saw it as optional. And that transformation is not just about numbers on a balance sheet. It's about a deeper psychological shift. India no longer sees itself as a recipient in global economics. It sees itself as a co-creator. It shapes standards, influences negotiations, and increasingly sets the terms of its own integration into global systems. That's power, not loud, aggressive power, but structural power. And structural power is the kind you can't sanction into submission. So the attempt to economically isolate India didn't just fail, it backfired. It revealed the fragility of old world assumptions and the strength of a new world emerging, one where nations like India are no longer bargaining from the periphery, but negotiating from the center. And in that shift lies the real lesson: you can't isolate what you already depend on. You can only adapt or be left behind by the very future you tried to control. While America was busy trying to play the old game of alliances and punishments, India was quietly helping design a new board altogether. That's what most people missed. While Western powers relied on their traditional networks, NATO, G7, and other legacy institutions, India began deepening ties with the very nations that had long been pushed to the margins of global influence. Not through dominance, but through diplomacy. Not through dictates, but through dialogue. And in doing so, India did something extraordinary. It turned the global south into a strategic asset, not just a moral symbol. BRICE became one of the most visible expressions of this shift, but it wasn't just about that acronym. It was about what BRICE represented: a recalibration of global power. With Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa at the core, and now with new members seeking entry, this group signaled a counterweight to the West's economic narratives. But more importantly, India's role in this space wasn't submissive. It wasn't just a participant, it was a balancing force, often mediating between rivals like China and Russia, while still asserting its own agenda. This was India's strength. It didn't need to dominate to lead. In a multipolar world, true influence doesn't come from control, it comes from trust, and India had built that trust over decades. Through development partnerships in Africa, energy agreements in the Middle East, education and tech collaboration with ASEAN, and humanitarian diplomacy that didn't come with political strings. These weren't grand gestures for headlines. They were deliberate, long-term relationships based on respect, not extraction. So when the West tried to pressure India by isolating it politically or criticizing its independent stance, it found itself increasingly alone in its outrage, because the rest of the world wasn't watching India with suspicion. They were watching it with admiration. Here was a country that could sit at the table with both the US and Iran, with both Russia and Ukraine's allies, with China and the Indo-Pacific democracies, and still keep its own posture intact. In that sense, India wasn't just resisting Western pressure, it was quietly building an alternative diplomatic architecture. One where dialogue was prioritized over alignment, where national interest didn't require ideological purity, and where smaller nations finally saw a model of leadership that didn't demand submission. That's what made the US strategy so ineffective and, frankly, humiliating, because while America was trying to sideline India, India was becoming the bridge between worlds. And that's the real story here. Not that India defied the West, but that it offered the world something more compelling than defiance, an example of how power can be exercised without domination, how partnerships can thrive without dependence, and how a country can rise, not by joining someone else's empire, but by helping others escape it. Sometimes, the future isn't shaped by those who shout the loudest, but by those who quietly bring others to the table. One of the most underestimated forces in global power struggles today isn't military or economic, it's narrative. The ability to shape perception, to control how a nation is seen by the world, is a soft power weapon that has toppled governments and rewritten histories. And for a long time, the United States held the microphone. Through its media institutions, think tanks, film industry, and digital platforms, America learned how to frame the story. Who's the villain? Who's the victim? Who's civilized and who's problematic? But when it came to India, that strategy met an unexpected wall. The narrative didn't land. The world didn't buy it. And that, more than any diplomatic failure, was a quiet humiliation. There was a coordinated effort, subtle yet sustained, to portray India as slipping from democratic values, as unreliable in its alliances, or morally compromised in its global decisions. The headlines were crafted, the panel discussions were framed. But here's the problem with that approach. When a narrative is built on manipulation rather than truth, it doesn't survive the complexity of real-world observation. Nations across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe were watching India not through the lens of ideology, but through the lens of experience. And what they saw was a country navigating a turbulent world with consistency, maturity, and strategic clarity. The attempt to discredit India only revealed how disconnected the Western narrative machine had become from the new global consciousness. In a world where people are increasingly skeptical of centralized media and elite opinion, narrative control doesn't guarantee belief. It often breeds resistance. And in India's case, it did something more profound. It triggered a wave of internal self-reflection and external solidarity. Indians, both at home and in the diaspora, began challenging the double standards. Why was India held to moral standards the West didn't apply to its own actions? Why was neutrality framed as weakness when practiced by the East, but as pragmatism when exercised by the West? This dissonance didn't just weaken the West's credibility, it strengthened India's. Not because India ran a counter-propaganda campaign, but because it didn't have to. Its actions spoke louder than anyone's headlines. Vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, rescue operations in conflict zones, peaceful handling of border tensions, global leadership in digital public infrastructure. These weren't the moves of a reckless or regressive state. They were the hallmarks of a nation stepping confidently into global leadership without needing anyone's permission. And that's where the real psychological shift occurred. The world began to see through the fog of narrative manipulation. India wasn't the story being told, it was the reality being lived. And for a country that had once been spoken for, this was its moment of narrative independence. Because in the end, power isn't just about who controls the narrative, it's about who earns the world's respect despite it. The true test of power isn't how loudly a nation reacts under pressure, it's how calmly it holds its ground when the world expects it to collapse. And in that regard, India's response to America's attempt at isolation was not just strategic, it was deeply dignified. There was no global outrage campaign, no counter-sanctions, no angry retaliation. Instead, India did something that confused and quietly disarmed its critics. It stayed rooted. It chose maturity over melodrama, clarity over chaos. And in doing so, it exposed something far more humbling for those who tried to corner at India didn't need to fight back to win. Its restraint was its victory. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. It reflected a psychological depth that comes from a long civilizational memory. India knows the patterns of power. It has lived under empires, broken from colonizers, and endured attempts at subjugation for centuries. So when a superpower attempts to reassert its dominance through political pressure, economic signals, or media narratives, India doesn't panic, it remembers, and that memory gives it something no sanctions or criticism can shake: self-trust. What the world saw, what even India's critics were forced to witness, was a country that could face diplomatic fire without losing its composure. A country that could disagree with the West while maintaining partnerships with it. A country that didn't insult those who tried to pressure it, but didn't yield to them either. That balance is rare in international affairs. And when exercised consistently, it becomes something far greater than strategy. It becomes an ethical stance, a demonstration of how national strength doesn't always require noise or defiance. Sometimes it simply requires not abandoning your principles under pressure. And perhaps that's where America found itself most frustrated. The attempt to isolate India didn't provoke the kind of reaction that would validate the effort. There was no scandal, no diplomatic breakdown, no public spectacle. Just silence, sovereignty, and unshaken direction. That is hard to deal with, not because it's aggressive, but because it's untouchable. And untouchable not by might, but by moral resolve. This moment in India's journey wasn't just about resisting Western pressure. It was about modeling a different kind of power, one that doesn't need constant validation, one that doesn't chase approval, one that draws strength from alignment with its own values, not from alliance with the dominant narrative. In a world increasingly shaped by reaction and polarization, India chose centeredness. In an age of fragile egos and ideological theatrics, India chose quiet strength, and in doing so, it reminded the world of a timeless truth. You don't rise by fighting for attention. You rise by standing so firmly in your truth that the world is forced to notice you, even when you say nothing at all.